Imagine helping to design the most successful wide-body twin-engine aircraft in the history of aviation. You sit at the table with the manufacturer, you dictate the cabin width, you demand robust landing gear, and you literally shape the future of long-haul travel. And then, when the plane is finally ready, you turn around and say, "No thanks, we don't want it." Well, that is exactly what Australia's flagship carrier, Qantas, did with the Boeing 777. Not just once, but 7 separate times. Instead of buying the twin-engine marvel they helped create, they went all in on the massive Airbus A380, and they forced Boeing to build them a highly customized, incredibly rare version of the 747. It is one of the most fascinating, expensive, and heavily debated fleet strategy decisions in modern airline history. And a former CEO of Qantas even admitted that if he had a time machine, he would go back and change it all. Before we dive into the boardrooms and the billions of dollars at stake in this story, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps out. And if you love deep dives into aviation economics and history, you are exactly in the right place. So, let us rewind back to the early 1990s. Boeing was doing something completely unprecedented. Instead of just building a new plane and trying to sell it to airlines on a take-it-or-leave-it basis, they formed the Working Together Group. They invited 8 major global airlines to co-design their new aircraft, the 777. Those airlines were United, American, Delta, British Airways, Cathay Pacific, All Nippon Airways, Japan Airlines, and Qantas. Qantas was instrumental in this process. Because they operate in a harsh, demanding environment, they heavily advocated for a wider cabin and incredibly tough landing gear. But when the dust settled and the order books opened, out of those 8 original launch partners, Qantas was the only one that never ordered the 777. Why? Well, you have to look at the leadership at the time. Under the late CEO James Strong, Qantas was incredibly distracted. They were busy privatizing and absorbing the domestic carrier Australian Airlines. They looked at the 777, evaluated it a staggering 7 times throughout the 90s, and rejected it every single time. They felt their existing fleet of heavily utilized 747s and 767s was doing the job just fine. They simply did not want to take on the massive financial risk and the maintenance headache of introducing a completely new, unproven twin-engine type into their system. But the aviation world was changing fast, and by the year 2000, a new CEO, Jeff Dixon, took the reins. Dixon knew Qantas needed a generational leap for their long-haul network, especially the famous kangaroo route between Australia and London, and the massive trans-Pacific hops to Los Angeles. Boeing knocked on the door again, pushing the 777. But Dixon and his team looked at the map, and they looked at the airports. They were betting everything on hub and spoke economics. Places like London Heathrow and LAX were facing extreme slot constraints. You could not just add more flights, because there were literally no landing slots available. The Qantas logic was straightforward. If you only have a few landing slots, you need to push as many passengers through them as physically possible. Enter the Airbus A380. Qantas was actually the first airline to sign a firm contract for the Super Jumbo in late 2000. They believed the A380 was the ultimate hub-busting weapon. It could carry nearly 500 passengers in Qantas's configuration, and the sheer geometry of the plane offered unparalleled comfort. The A380 fuselage is over 7.1 meters wide, compared to the 777 at 6.2 meters. This allowed Qantas to maintain wider seats and larger aisles even in economy. Plus, the plane was pressurized to a lower cabin altitude, dramatically reducing jet lag on those grueling 14-hour flights. But the A380 order left a glaring hole in the Qantas network. The A380 was too big for certain routes. And their older 747S didn't quite have the range to reliably fly point to point from Melbourne to Los Angeles fully loaded against strong headwinds without stopping. They needed something else. They still refused to buy the 777. They argued it was stuck in an awkward middle ground, too heavy and large for domestic routes, but lacking the sheer passenger volume needed for the flagship international trunk routes. Furthermore, flying twin-engine aircraft across the vast, empty stretches of the Southern Pacific and Indian Oceans meant dealing with ETOPS, extended-range twin-engine operational performance standards. At the time, twin-engine reliability was good, but Qantas still fiercely favored the safety, redundancy, and absolute comfort blanket of four engines for those specific, ultra-isolated routes. So Qantas went back to Boeing with a very specific, almost audacious request. They basically said, "We do not want your 777, but we do want you to build us a brand new, bespoke 747. Boeing, surprisingly, agreed. They developed the Boeing 747-400ER, standing for Extended Range. They took the standard 747-400, strengthened the fuselage, reinforced the landing gear and parts of the wings, slapped on larger tires, and added optional auxiliary fuel tanks in the forward cargo hold. Qantas opted for a single extra tank, increasing the maximum takeoff weight to a massive 412,770 kilograms. This gave the plane the exact extra range Qantas needed to reliably fly Melbourne to LAX without restrictions. Boeing built exactly 6 of these 747-400ER passenger jets. Every single one of them went to Qantas. No other airline in the world ordered the passenger variant of the 400ER. It was a completely unique sub-fleet, purpose-built to fill the gap, because Qantas stubbornly refused to buy the 777. As the years rolled on, the aviation landscape shifted yet again, and the cracks in the A380 strategy began to show. This brings us to a crucial, often overlooked factor in airline economics: cargo volume. You might assume that a larger, heavier plane like the A380 naturally carries more cargo, generating more ancillary revenue. But the reality is the exact opposite. The A380's massive structure and the weight of 2 full passenger decks severely limit the payload left for actual freight. The Boeing 777-300ER, on the other hand, became a massive cargo powerhouse for airlines around the world. On routes where passenger demand fluctuates during off-peak seasons, airlines use heavy, lucrative cargo to subsidize the cost of the flight. The A380 often simply could not carry enough freight to balance the books on a half-empty flight. The 777 could be highly profitable even with a lighter passenger load because its lower deck was packed with cargo. Alan Joyce, who took over as Qantas CEO after Jeff Dixon, inherited this massive A380 fleet. And while the A380 was a huge hit with passengers and generated incredible revenue on peak routes, like the Dallas to Sydney run, which brought in over $400 million annually before the pandemic, Joyce realized the strategic corner the airline had painted itself into. Joyce famously went on the record and admitted that if he had a time machine, he would go back to the year 2000 and change the fleet order made by his predecessors. He acknowledged that skipping the 777 cost Qantas an incredible amount of route flexibility. Without the 777, they were forced to squeeze extra life out of those gas-guzzling 747s for years, just waiting for the Boeing 787-9 Dreamliners to finally arrive and fill the twin-engine, long-haul gap. Qantas originally intended to operate a massive fleet of super jumbos. Following their initial order of 12, they bumped the commitment up to 20 aircraft. But as the economics of 4 engines shifted, they stopped taking deliveries at 12. For years, those remaining 8 orders sat in limbo on the Airbus books. Finally, in February 2019, Qantas formally canceled those remaining 8 orders. It was a massive blow to the A380 program, and just days later, Airbus announced they were shutting down production of the Super Jumbo entirely. Today, Qantas operates a heavily Airbus-centric fleet for its future, with the A350 chosen for the ultra-long-haul Project Sunrise flights to London and New York, completely bypassing the new Boeing 777X. They looked at the 777X, but its massive size, sheer weight, and ongoing certification delays made it a no-go for their new strategy of point-to-point fragmentation. History, it seems, loves to repeat itself. Yet, despite all the economic hurdles, the A380 remains an absolute icon. Qantas currently has 10 of their original 12 A380s back in service, squeezing every last drop of utility out of them until their planned retirement in the 2030s. They even keep one as a dedicated operational spare in Sydney, just to ensure that if a Super Jumbo has a technical issue, they do not leave nearly 500 people stranded. It is a story of calculated risks, bespoke engineering, and the harsh realities of airline economics. Qantas helped birth the 777, walked away from it, pushed all their chips onto the A380, and ended up with a fleet that was perfectly tailored to a very specific era of aviation. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Qantas fleet strategy, please drop a like on the video and make sure you are subscribed to the channel for more aviation content. Let me know in the comments below. Do you think Qantas made the right call holding on to 4 engines for so long? Or should they have bought the 777 from the start? See you in the next one.